the hierarchy or the classification of research experience, I think it's always important to understand the various forms of publishing because it's a very fast evolving field, as Sam already mentioned. Um, We'll start to speak, to start the session, we'll explore why do we even do research and why do we publish? I'd like to hear what your views are on this. And then I'll try to explain some of the things I think are important considerations. All of these are my personal opinions based on my experiences as well. And then we'll explore the publication models, traditional versus open access. And there's some things I like to always touch upon when I speak about research and publication. These are issues around innovation, but also challenges because we know it's a challenging field out there. So I'll speak about some of the challenges that I have experienced being an academic that started my career in the global south and now working in the global north. And then I'll share some recommendations and I'll be keen to hear what your perspectives are on all of these. Um, I'm hoping everyone's familiar with Slido, and I'm hoping, even if you're not familiar with it, I hope you indulge me. So if you just go online to slido.com and it'll ask you for a number. And if you just put in 5743450, they're just two quick questions I'd like to pose to you just to get a sense of who's in the room and what you think about the conversation or the topic for today's session. So the first question is, why are you interested in publishing? So I'm keen to know, why you're interested in publishing, and feel free to, you could just write a word, a couple of words, whatever captures your main interests in publishing. And I guess part of this is also research. So why do you do research and why are you interested in publishing? And I think it's really important because for some people, they do the research, but they are not necessarily interested in publishing the research. So that's also a possibility. So why are you interested if you're one who's interested in publishing? Thanks to those who are already typing in their responses. Yeah, I see the publish or perish, and it sounds very familiar to me, having started my career in Nigeria. So I get that. And to be fair, even outside of Nigeria, I've heard people say publish and perish in very many settings. So that's interesting, publish or perish. So why are you interested in publishing? While people are exploring that question, the second one, if you've already answered the first one, is on a scale of 1 to 5, how often have you tried to read a paper and hit a paywall? So 5 being very often and 1 being perhaps never. So it'll be good to just see what your experiences have been with the publications. I think someone put in 5743450 for the first question. I'm not sure if that's a code. I don't have the machine for breaking that code. So if you could please just type in the actual response, that would be helpful. So thanks to everyone who's interacted with the posts and the polls. Now, from my own perspective, why do we publish? We've had the response, publish or perish, which really points to the fact that publishing is critical. And I want to believe that whoever's written that is someone who's in the academic field. So maybe a researcher or a lecturer or aspiring to be one. So publications are seen as fundamental in this space. But I think it's also important to see research and publications as very critical ways of understanding complex human development challenges which we face. Because there's so many challenges these days, economic, social, environmental, and very often they're complex, they are multidimensional. And so it is through research and publications that we're able to understand the nuances of these complexities. Because what then happens is people, based on their expertise, based on coming together, collaborations, are able to unpack these problems in a way that then makes sense to the rest of us. And sometimes are also able to provide us with solutions based on their innovative findings. I think the second imperative is that it allows us to interrogate systemic inequalities when we do research and when we publish the research. Now, if you think about it, when I asked the question of how often you've tried to read a paper and hit a paywall, a lot of people have put in often or neutral. And the truth is, depending on where you go, the responses will change. So if I use myself as an example again, when I was in the Global South as a researcher or as an academic, the number of times when I would face this problem of hitting a paywall was quite high. I used to have to rely on my colleagues in other countries, other parts of the world, whenever I wanted a paper, because most of the papers I wanted to do my research were hidden behind paywalls. But now, having transitioned to the global north, it is less of a challenge for me because I'm in an institution that is able to afford the costs of most of the subscriptions. And so most of the journals that I need are easily accessible to me. So I think that in itself already points to some of the inequalities when it comes to education, when it comes to research, when it comes to publications, which we need to be mindful of. So research and publication allows us to really interrogate those systemic inequalities, but also very often even just reveals those systemic inequalities for what they are. A third imperative is around uncovering challenges and good practices for human and planetary well-being to the extent that through research, through publications, we're able to understand good ways of doing things, which may not necessarily come from our own practice, our own experiences, our own understanding, but have been uncovered by other people in the field. And of course, research and publication allows opportunities for democratizing science. And by this, I mean that it just opens up the space because even though those who conduct the research and do the publications perhaps are those who have access to certain resources, to the labs and things like that, the rest of us are able to access this. So, to that extent, research and publication actually allows, to some level, the democratization of science. So, opens up a space for the rest of us, for the public to get involved in the intellectual discourse. And finally, I think it's also important from the lens of ethics, accountability, and effective governance, because research and publications shows us tools for achieving this, and of course allows for evidence-informed decision making in political and governance spaces. Now, what are some of the important considerations when we're doing research? And which also leads very nicely to the topic for today's discussion. One is that when we do research, it needs to be accessible and people need to be able to use it. Now, there are very many reasons for which research may not be accessible. The cost is one thing. So if it's behind the paywall, obviously that is a problem. But it could also be just the language in which we have written it or the outlets which we have chosen for putting out the research. And so it's important for us to think very critically whenever we want to put out something as a research output or as a publication to ask ourselves, is this accessible? Can this be used? So that's about the language, that's about the medium of dissemination, that's about perhaps even the timing of the dissemination. So you could write something that is, very much like understandable for your field, which is excellent, which is great. But you then have to think about, what about people outside of my field? Does this make sense to them? Will this make sense to them? I often hear people say that no one ever complains that a paper is too simple to understand. Very often the complaint is it is too complex to understand. And so simplicity is, I think it's the height of scholarly excellence. And that is something we need to strive for to ensure that our work remains accessible. The second important consideration is that the publication landscape is evolving. And so we're going very quickly, very rapidly from closed to open models. And of course, so we still have the traditional models of publishing, which are behind paywalls and all sorts of things. But what you find is that more and more, there are more opportunities to publish through open models. And in fact, there are lots of even independent, non-academic publication channels as well. Time there was when publications were really about journals, books, book chapters, end of story. In fact, I remember when I first started my academic career, I would really snub students who would write and refer to web pages, for instance. But clearly, the times have changed quite a lot because these days you have web pages that are really standard sources of information. And what that then means is that as early careers or as researchers, we need to be open-minded and think beyond those silos of this is an article, this is a paper, this is a book chapter, or this is a newspaper article, and start to explore what is the value of this form of publication. And ultimately, understanding that research systems are critical for visibility and compliance. So, visibility meaning there are sometimes when you publish something, if it never gets seen, then no one knows you even have an opinion on that piece of work or on that area of study. But if it's visible, then obviously people know what you think, where you stand, and people can see your contributions to the field. Very similarly for compliance, because sometimes some funders might want you to publish in specific journals or through specific channels. So you need to be aware of those requirements. Sometimes for promotion purposes, some institutions will say it needs to be this journal or that journal or this list of journals, which is absolutely fine. Now, one of the things that I decided quite early on in my academic career was that my publications will not necessarily be dictated by promotion. And that was very important for me. And the reason I say that is because I knew what I needed for the promotions, and that was fine. I was going to meet those. But it was also important for me to be able to explore my own initiative, my own preferences in terms of publication outlets and channels. So what it then meant was that in some instances, apologies, that's the doorbell. What it then meant was that in some instances, I was better off publishing in traditional journals, but in other instances, maybe I needed to write in a newspaper column or I had to do a newspaper article to reach a specific audience. Maybe I had to think about writing a blog post to reach a specific audience. So it didn't always have to be the traditional journal articles. I had to be open to exploring other ways of communicating my information as well to reach the intended audience. So that's something we always have to be mindful of. But at the same time, if the funder needed me to publish in specific journals, I would do that. But I wasn't going to be totally defined, or my publications aren't totally defined by that. And the reason is because remember, the requirements of the present may not be the requirements of the future. So you might be in a specific workplace or institution that says, look, this is our list of recommended journals. Excellent. But by the time you then pivot to something else, to a different career, to a different setting, you may find that actually the relevance of your work is dictated by something else. So if you ask me, I think variety is a spice in this instance. And so I'm always actively exploring other forms of publications that go beyond traditional articles. And in fact, for me, it's also been a way of learning and honing my communication skills. So being able to communicate my research in other forms, sometimes through arts, sometimes through blogs, sometimes through even just illustrations. It's all been for me part of honing my communication skills and also reaching diverse audiences. And let us also remember that people learn in different ways, people communicate in different ways. So out there might be people who are not really interested in the text. So the more we vary our channels of communication, the better for us. Um, the other thing that's really important as in terms of research and publications is understanding research and publications in a joined up way, essentially looking at how things go from the global level to the regional level to the national level and to the local level as well. So whenever you're dealing with a research problem, you need to think about how it all comes together beyond just the specific space that you are looking at. So you might be doing a research that is global, but you always have to think also about the relevance at the regional level, at the local level. Just as similarly, if you're doing research that is more local, you need to think about the relevance to other spaces as well. Because again, like I mentioned, you might immediately think that your concern is just at one level, but you never know how learning about the other levels will also increase your relevance, would increase your reach, and would increase your long-term contributions to the field. Now, another thing that's really important when it comes to research and publication is innovation. So if one is doing a PhD, for instance, of course, originality and innovation are non-negotiable. You have to do that. But even if one isn't doing a PhD, when it comes to publications, the publications that stand the test of time, the publications that get cited, if that's something you're interested in, are publications that add something to the field. So that novelty, that innovation is really important. And it's not just novelty in terms of, oh, let's bring up something that people haven't heard about before. No, but it's about let's bring up something that people haven't heard about, which is the novelty, but something that is also applicable and impactful. So I think that really to measure innovation, we need to be thinking about creativity, but we also need to be thinking about relevance, application, and impact for the wider community of scholars. And a lot of the times, people may think about this as comparative analysis because I come from a law background. So sometimes you find people doing research and they say, okay, well, if you want originality, I'll compare country A and country B. And I'm like, yes, that's good, but comparative analysis isn't necessarily the only answer to innovation. Let us think broadly about innovation in terms of novelty, but also in terms of application and impact. It could be about taking research that is usually applied to a specific field and saying, how do I make this relevant for other fields? How do I communicate this in a way that they understand? How do I communicate?
You just accidentally muted, I think. Oh, may have lost her for a minute.
Can you hear me?
Okay, she's
Sure
back.
can. You're back.
Yes.
Can you see the slides?
Yep.
Oh yeah. Okay. Sorry about that. Thank you.
No
Um,
problem. All good.
so so I was talking about the importance of application and impact when we think about innovation. So not just about bringing up something new, but thinking about how that remains relevant for everyone else. And to give an example, I would like to use the current research that I'm working on, which is around gender inclusive climate change governance. Now, there's been a lot of discussions around climate change and the links to climate justice and the relative experiences or positions of various groups of people. Sometimes we hear them talk about marginalized people, excluded people, vulnerabilities, and things like that. Now, the reason I want to use this as an example is to just illustrate how I basically started from one research activity, but then held onto it and developed it further. And it has, I mean, for the next maybe 4 to 7 years, possibly will be the main focus of my research. So in 2020, this was around the time of COVID, because I still remember having to do the conference online because there was lockdown. I did this paper on gender and climate litigation. So it was a conference that was focused on climate change litigation. And I decided to focus on the gender dimensions of climate litigation for that conference. This was in 2020. And did the conference. It was a really good one, got perspectives from different um, scholars who attended. And then there was meant to be a special issue. So the conference organizers asked, do you want to contribute to a special issue or would you want to contribute to a book chapter? And I said I wanted to contribute to a special issue because for me, I was more interested in getting a journal publication out of the conference experience than in getting a book chapter. That was my thinking at the time. That's what I wanted to do. And so went through the process, started, submitted the first draft. In the middle of all of this, I changed jobs, moved to a new country, got pregnant, had a baby. And in fact, I remember just before going into hospital for the delivery, I got the review comments for the paper. And I just knew it wasn't happening. And so I couldn't meet the deadline for the special issue. So then the organizers came back and said, well, you haven't met the deadline. Of course, they knew my personal circumstances at the time. So they asked me what I wanted to do. And I just thought, I'll come back to it when I come back to it. And then after some time, they came back and said, oh, we're now doing the book. Are you still interested in contributing it as a book chapter? Because clearly you've got the review comments already. All you need to do is just address the comments and then we can publish it. And I got around to doing it. And then the book chapter got published around 2023. Now, in 2024, no, actually in 2023, same year, there was an opportunity to apply for the UKRI, which is UK Research and Innovation Future Leaders Fellowship funding. And so I thought I needed to come up with an idea for the funding application. What did I do? Rather than start something new, I went back to that same idea that I had published in the book chapter at that time. I picked it up and I decided I wanted to explore it further. And then I built it up and it became the proposal. So in 2024, I was awarded a fellowship and I have started the research, which is meant to last for 4 years and possibly up to 7 years. Then on the back of that, I started the research, started setting it up, and I'm still in the process of setting up the research anyway, the projects, because like Sam mentioned, the multi-country project has different dimensions and all of that. But on the back of that book chapter, I did the proposal, got the award. And then I thought, okay, how is this now relevant beyond the academic space? And that led to, in December 2024, my proposing to the International Law Association Nigeria that there was a need for them to set up a committee on women, international law, and development, which I currently chair. And that's running. It's been really impactful because before we set up that committee, the ILA Nigeria did not have a committee on women, international law, and development. So there was a committee on natural resources and environment, which I was a part of. There was a committee on business and human rights. There was a committee on arbitration. There were several other committees, but there was just none on women. So the point I'm trying to make is to illustrate how what started as a conference submission to a conference paper, to a published book chapter, and then to a grant application, and then to setting up a committee for a professional association. Same idea in different forms. And that's really important, I think, because before now, I was one of those people who would always, when I'm invited to speak or do a conference, I think, oh, I need a new idea, and I'll go and write it up and I'll submit it. So I had so many ideas, each conference would be a new paper, each conference would be a new abstract, each conference would be a new experience. But what this has taught me, and I made a conscious decision, was to say, no, rather than do something new every time, how about I do something and I build on it? And that's now my mantra. So my suggestion to you or my call to action would be to say, think about it. What's that one thing that you have been working on that you found really interesting and that you can build on and explore in various directions, whether within the academic space or beyond that? Because what I've found is that somehow it allows you to gain traction, it allows you to build actually impactful outcomes and to build really strong collaborations through that process. And the other thing I've been trying to actively do through this is to also grow a social media presence that builds on the research as a way of, again, expanding the reach and expanding the outcomes and democratizing the space further. So I'm not only thinking about it in terms of the academic. So if you ask me, I'll tell you, well, I've got the book chapter published. So if you want an academic publication out of this, here you go. If you want a public community engagement angle out of it, here you go with a committee. If you want a research scholarship evidence type thing, you also have the grants. But if you want a public engagement, then look at the social media. So one idea, one research activity, one publication could actually form the foundation of so many other things. So I would invite you to just think about that in light of the work that you do and in light of the various publications that you have. And oh yes, in 2025, we also had a special issue. So we hosted a special issue with the Journal of Sustainable Development Law and Policy that again was built on gender and energy transition in the global south and had contributions for various parts. We had contributions from Latin America, we had contributions from Africa, and we had contributions both from national and regional case studies as well. So in terms of reflections, I'd like you to reflect on one, what is your motivation for doing research beyond publish or perish? because you need to go beyond that. That could very well be a starting point, but research is more than that. And the second thing is, how often do you discuss research and publications with people and organizations outside your discipline? And I think that's really important because what I've found is the more I speak to non-lawyers, the more I get new ideas, the more I get challenged to my deep-seated values and my deep-seated approaches, and the more I'm able to expand my scholarship in very meaningful ways. And if you're involved in a journal or an institution or indeed an association like Gary, if you're exploring, for instance, expanding into publications, if you're not doing that already, think about whether you have policies and frameworks for ethical research and innovation which supports the career of early researchers. Because I know that sometimes early career researchers find themselves in a position where there's gatekeeping, and so that gatekeeping comes with additional burdens for early career researchers. So journals and institutions and people in leadership positions need to think very critically about how they're contributing to policies and frameworks that promote ethical research and innovation, but also supports the development, the career advancement of early career researchers. And think about whether the research policies and processes are really accessible for all, taking into account the context and experiences of various researchers, and whether there are open access publication options for your journal. Now, that leads us really nicely to the conversation around the models for publication. And so we have the traditional models and the open access. So the traditional ones I'm talking about where you submit to a journal and then the journal handles the peer review, the publication, and very often once the paper is accepted, it is hidden behind a paywall, which means that you need to pay a subscription to be able to access it. So for those who are privileged to be in institutions that are able to afford the payments, excellent, they get access to them or to the papers, but otherwise it becomes difficult to access. I found myself in tricky situations where I've written a book chapter and then I don't have access to the book chapter. And I'm thinking, oh, who can help me get access to it? Because perhaps the copy I was given by the publishers, I no longer have access to it for whatever number of reasons. And so that's a very tricky situation to be in. It's my piece of work, it's out there, people are accessing it, but I'm having to cross hurdles to be able to access it. Now, what are the pros of traditional models of publication? With all of these problems, why do we still do it? One thing is that you think about impact factor. So a lot of the times, these journals, these publications have high impact factors. And very often, there's no upfront cost to you as a contributor or as an author. But of course, the downside to it is there's limited reach because it's only accessible to those who are able to pay. And you also find that as a contributor, you're signing over your copyrights to whoever has published it, versus the open access models where the research is freely accessible online and authors retain the copyrights to it. Now, there are different models to the open access. You may have heard about gold, green, diamond, or hybrid. Gold essentially is where the final version is available online for free. And of course, that's the super standard, right? But you also have the green version, which is where the final version is not accessible, but the publisher allows you to upload a preprint. So something that is not the final version. So it could be a preprint or it could be your final version that is not formatted by the publisher. So sometimes publishing agreements allow you to do that. So that is the green access. And then of course there's a diamond access, which is free for readers and authors. And then there's a hybrid where there's a mix of it. Now, the downside to it is that a lot of the times when you go for open access, there's a high auto processing charge, which a lot of people have to rely on their institutions to pay, otherwise it's not accessible. And then the quality varies. So some journals or some publication outlets are freely available, but we have to be mindful of predatory journals, which means that perhaps the journal hasn't gone through the right processes for review. And so what then happens is when you put your work in there, just because of the reputation of that journal or that outlet, your work doesn't get the traction that it deserves. So that's something to be mindful of in terms of the downside. And then, of course, disciplinary differences, because some disciplines just require specific journals, simple as, and then other disciplines are a bit more flexible. So we need to be mindful of all of these differences. Now, what are the challenges to innovative research and publication in this landscape? I think one thing that clearly comes out of this is inadequate funding. So, if you're in an institution that is not able to pay the subscriptions, or an institution that does not support early career research and along those lines, then clearly that is a problem. And so, in some cases, you have limited domestic investments in research and development. In some other cases, there's overdependence on external funders and donor priorities, which then means that early career researchers have less room to be innovative and to do research that really excites them, but they have to do the research in very predetermined ways that are out of their control. And then sometimes the funding system is just unstable, whether due to political changes or due to other changes outside the control of the academic and the control of the researcher. So there are all of these challenges when it comes to funding. A second challenge is around weak infrastructure. So sometimes you find that there's limited access to relevant databases and repositories. For some journals, in fact, for all journals, I would say good practice is you understand what's already been published in that journal before you then bring in your publication. But obviously, to do that, you need access to the databases or to the repositories. So that could be a challenge if you don't have that access. Sometimes, depending on where you are, again, coming from my experience in the global south, there could be unreliable power and internet connections, which then means that as an early career researcher, you're having to grapple with not just the intellectual side of things, but even just the logistics and the infrastructure for doing the research. And sometimes there's just a lack of equipment. And very often this applies a lot to people who are maybe in the natural sciences, have to go into the labs, do research and things like that. Another very important challenge is around human capital and talent retention. So sometimes in some institutions, you find that they have very didactic ways of learning and rigid academic silos, which does not really allow for developing research skills and publication skills that are relevant in the modern systems. So that could be a challenge as well. Sometimes there is limited mentorship and incentives for young and middle career researchers. And of course, depending on where you find yourself, there could be problems with immigration and globalization, which means that you find more and more talents drifting in towards certain locations. And so there's less opportunities for peer review, peer support, and peer-to-peer just contributions to developing the scholarship together in the same space. Another very important challenge is around the policy and social political barriers. And so, like I mentioned, sometimes the politics of the day actually determines the relevance of your research. And so I do research around climate justice and gender equality. And of course, you know that depending on where you are, it is not an easy sell. In March, for instance, I was meant to go to a conference somewhere and I couldn't travel because people said, well, it wasn't safe to travel just because of the political climate in that space at that time and the topic that I was working on. So sometimes you find yourself having to deal with barriers that come more from the political and social political dimensions of the work that you do. And you also find that this sometimes affects the security of the work. It sometimes affects the bureaucracy around funding and ethics approvals. And it also means that you may not have as much access to knowledge exchange platforms as you would ordinarily want to. I've got a case study here which sort of highlights it, but I'll move on to the recommendations and reflections very quickly. So one of the reflections I would like us to think about is how do you measure the impact of your research as an early career researcher? And if you can think about one research paper that you've really enjoyed working on, just think about it. You know, it could be for those who are already publishing, it could be a research paper. For those who haven't published yet, it could be an assignment or a term paper. Just think about one that you have really enjoyed working on. And what I want you to ask yourself is, why did you enjoy working on it? What did you learn from that process? And how can you build on that for further work and implementation? So this comes back to the example I gave with the gender and climate justice research that I'm currently doing. So why did you do the work? What did you enjoy from that process? What did you learn? And how can you build on it for further work and implementation? And if you're in charge of a journal or you're in charge of leadership of academic spaces or mentoring of young or early career researchers, how do you incentivize and measure impact from the work of early career researchers? And are you convening platforms for knowledge transfer between researchers and knowledge users? Because this goes to the point we made earlier where we're saying research needs to be impactful, it needs to be applicable. So to what extent are you convening spaces where it's not just researchers talking to each other, but it's researchers talking to potential users of their research? And are you actually promoting interdisciplinary collaborations? Because these are really, really essential for the well-rounded development of early career researchers. And so to the recommendations, the final bit of my talk for this evening, thinking about all those challenges that I've already highlighted, I would say that one of the strategies for achieving innovation and research, and of course in then developing good quality publications, is understanding the real life and theoretical aspects of a problem. Because sometimes we're so engrossed in the real life aspects, we don't tackle the theoretical aspects as much. Sometimes we're so engrossed in the theoretical aspects and we forget that the proposals, the recommendations need to be relevant to everyday people. So we need to have a good understanding of that balance between the real life situation and the theoretical aspects of the problem. Secondly, we need to explore interdisciplinary research methods and collaboration. So we need to think local. And that's why I gave the example of thinking about how problems are linked from the global level all the way to the local level. So it's not just about your case study, but it's about your case study in context. We also need to think about engagement with various communities of practice, various stakeholders, various actors, various actresses, various institutions, various um, laws and political or legal frameworks, regulatory frameworks. We need to think about all that in the way that we design our research and we implement it. And we also need to adhere to ethical standards because if we do, it just makes it easier for us to access diverse publication platforms. And of course, we need to plan for impact because impact, of course, it can happen organically, but we always need to plan for it, I think, because if you don't plan for it, what happens is you miss opportunities for impact. So it doesn't mean that you have to be too rigid in your approach to research, but I'm just saying be a bit intentional from the start. Then, of course, once you're intentional from the start, you would be more readily able to identify and explore opportunities for impact as you go along. Now, for the funding challenge itself, I think there's some ways we can overcome it if we find ourselves as early careers in situations where there is less funding for the research that we want to do. One thing we can explore is crowdfunding and research commercialization. So we can think about how our research can lend itself to application in the industry, how we can partner with startups, how we can partner with private sector and get funding for the research. We can also think about how there could be micro grants to enable researchers to build their credentials and confidence. And this is where associations like Gary come in and collaborations with other similar associations and institutions as well. And we should think about providing accountability and transparency frameworks for existing funding structures and simplifying application processes. Because it's not always the fact that there's no funding. Sometimes there's funding, but it's just about how it is being administered that does not really favor early career researchers. For infrastructure deficits, we could think about how we pool resources. So this could be pulling resources at the level of institutions, or it could be at the level of associations like yourselves. We could also think about how we harness domestic innovations and indigenous knowledge systems to develop sustainable infrastructure systems, which necessarily means thinking beyond collaborations in academia and thinking about collaborations with other sectors and spaces as well. Now, for human capital and knowledge retention, we could think about how the welfare, the safety, the well-being of researchers are protected. We could think about how we're investing in lifelong learning, training, and capacity building. We could think about how we celebrate innovations amongst ourselves as a way of encouraging excellence. And we could also think about how we build partnerships with researchers and institutions in various countries. This is more about the partnerships, ethics, insurance, some of the things I've already mentioned. Insurance, I think, is really important as a way of ensuring safety, especially given the political climates that we very often find ourselves working in. Um, and I think that's it really. I think I've highlighted most of this already. Um, yeah. I'll make one last point though, the point about metrics. And I think that's really important because, like I said at the beginning, sometimes people look at the impact factors, but we also need to think beyond impact factors. So it's fine to have publications that are there because you want to publish in high impact factors, but also think about the relevance and accessibility of those publications. And it might mean that you have one publication, but you disseminate it in various forms to different audiences. And I think that's it really. Three final reflections. Research has potential to bridge the gap between knowledge and policy, but also to advance innovative solutions. For research to advance sustainable development, it needs to be informed by and responsive to local context, rigorous and scalable, and innovation requires novelty, application, and impact. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We have some time for questions. Do you need a sip of water or anything? I know that was probably a lot to deliver all that content.
Absolutely fine. Thank you.
Okay, amazing. So the first question is from one of our participants. They're wondering that given that many scholars publish primarily for the sake of promotion, and that such tensions exist both in the Western and African academic contexts, is it possible to overcome this fear-driven motivation over time?
Thank you very much. Is it possible? Yes. But I
Good.
think it's more about how long does it take us to overcome it. So it's something we need to be intentional about. It's something we need to be very we need to have a plan. So like I mentioned at the beginning, for me, when I started my career, I was lecturing in Nigeria and it was very clear what the criteria were for promotion. So I knew how many publications I needed in whatever number of years to get to the next level, right? So what it then meant for me was that in designing or in planning my publications, I would say, well, in the next 3 years, you need this number of publications in this kinds of journals. So I would meet that criteria, but it also meant I could think about other things that I wanted to do because I wanted to do them. So we need to be intentional about it, and it's something that can be overcome.
Thank you. Okay, I have another one. So more attention now is being put on research and action. So what can organizations do to actually grow their capacity and gain support for programs that actually encourage mentorship and applied impact?
Thank you very much. I think it would depend on what kinds of organization it is. So, if it is, for instance, an academic institution that has senior professionals or professors and then has early career academics, I think it's important to provide some kind of incentive and recognition system for the seniors. Because what you find is that there's so much pressure on the time of senior academics. There's calls for them to review papers, to mentor colleagues. There's calls for them to supervise PhDs. There's marking, there's teaching, there's all sorts of things, and then there's life itself. So I think some form of recognition or incentive that speaks to the priorities of senior career, professionals will be useful because it would then allow them to create some space and recognize the importance of the mentoring. And I think it's really important that the institutions give something to that process because if institutions do not actively show support for it, then they're more or less relying on the senior academics to do it over and over again. So it's almost a double burden on them. And I don't think that's the right way to do it. So the institutions need to be deliberate about investing in the senior academics and motivating them to invest in the early career academics as well or researchers. And I think the other thing that's important is to ensure that there's a diverse pool of people. Now, that's really important because you could have senior academics and early careers, but they're just not speaking to each other. Maybe they don't, the language is not there, the lived experiences are very different, or they just they're all those blockers. There are lots of blockers that could exist. So I think the more diverse the pools are, the better the chances of these two groups or multiple groups actually speaking to each other. And I think the third thing would be that they create platforms where this can happen. And it needs to be platforms that are not high pressure. Because a lot of the times, the best conversations happen over lunch, over a team bonding exercise, not when someone's breathing down your neck and saying, we have these deadlines, we need to do this, we need to get that done. No. So those kinds of opportunities for people to just unwind, relax, get to know each other, and build trust, I think would really help for mentoring.
I agree. I had someone ask actually if they'll be able to get a copy of the slides, Dr. O'Bani. I know we're sending out the recording, but could they get a copy of the slides as well?
Yeah, that's fine. I'm happy to share that.
Amazing. Thank you. Okay. How will the cost of our publications resonate with the outcome? What is the relationship there?
Is that the cost in terms of the publication costs or the research costs?
I think probably the publication cost, but if there's nuances that you want to distinguish, might be helpful.
Um, I've 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 had to decline publishing in specific journals for this reason of the costs.
Okay.
And that's because, I mean, this is me speaking personally now. That's because we do lots of reviews, right? So you review for journals, you don't get paid for that. And then you have to pay to get published. And I think it's just, it doesn't add up. Yes, there are costs in terms of producing the publication and all that. I know that, and I agree. There are those costs. But I think a lot of the times what then happens is because I think that um maybe I don't think it's fair, it's too expensive, or whatever it is, for whatever number of reasons. Even when I see publications in those journals, I may not regard them in the same way because I almost feel like, well, they've paid to get it published there. So what's the value of that? So I think it's difficult to answer the question without knowing the exact circumstances and context. But what I know is that sometimes you find journals providing some allowances for maybe researchers from certain parts of the world, so maybe low-income countries or developing countries, so-called, whatever allowances are made. But I think ultimately, the principles of it need to be interrogated. The fact that research is being produced without any additional pecuniary benefits to the researcher, and then it's being published and for a fee. So there's a fee coming to the publishers, but nothing coming back to, whoever's contributed. I think that whole system just needs to be interrogated, and for us to be sure that what we're doing is actually creating fairness in the system and it's not excluding people who would ordinarily be passionate about research excellence.
Thanks for answering that. Okay, we have a few more for you. So this person is wondering about the fact that there is weak foundation of research standards in parts of Africa and Asia, and often that results in limited recognition in Western academia. So how does this disparity shape the academic experiences of scholars who might migrate to a different location for advanced study or collaboration? And a follow-up is around just measures that can promote mutual credibility and more balance when you're a global research scholar and evaluator.
Thank you very much. I think that's a very interesting question. So the point about weak foundations of research standards, I think it's something that needs to be unpacked a bit more because my first reaction would be, what do we mean by weak foundations, right? Like, how are we assessing those standards? Now, what I know is there could be different standards. So it's not so much about one being weak or strong, but it's just about different standards, simple as. So I made the point about promotions, for instance, and how in my previous institution in Nigeria, it was about the number of publications. I knew how many I had to go for. I knew the other things I needed to do. In my current institution, I've never seen a number of publications listed as part of the promotion criteria. So it's just about different standards. The other thing is it's also about different educational systems, but ultimately, the answer to that disparity is there will always be those differences. There would always be differences in standards, differences in expectations. But what we have to ask ourselves as academics, as scholars, is do I want to be a global academic or do I want to be a national academic, as it were? Because what then happens is if you want to be a global scholar, and I guess that's how you address those differences in the standards, you need to really be open to understanding what are the standards that exist in various parts, which also comes back to the point we made in the presentation about tailoring your publication to different audiences, because that makes you a bit more versatile than if you were only focused on the standards required in the system where you currently find yourself. So my advice would be open up yourself, your perspective, and this could be through reading publications from various parts of the world. It could be attending conferences. It could be having colleagues in various parts. LinkedIn is there, connect with people, see what they're doing, try and understand why they're doing things in certain ways, and see how best you can learn from their good practices to improve your own work.
Hmm. And with an organization like we're representing today, Gari, how can an organization like this help bridge that type of gap with third world countries and their researchers not necessarily being recognized and accepted by first world country scholars?
I think one of the things that could happen is that you provide those platforms for collaboration between the two, because what then comes out of it is the skills they rub off on each other. So the people from the global south countries and global north countries would learn one or two things from each other and invariably improve their practice. Um, One thing that I've been involved in that I really, really valued was a publication experience where I was the academic and then I was working with practitioners. So these were practitioners with years of practice experience but had never published a paper. So they had loads of reports, international reports, well recognized, but obviously in the academic circles, those were not regarded as they were gray literature. And so what I did with them was to sit with them and then work together on how to get their work into an academic journal article. And it was brilliant. I learned a lot from that experience. They also learned a lot from the experience. So I think associations like Gary could provide those platforms where there's mutual learning between academics, researchers from various parts. And you could also provide a platform for even just the publication of the findings. So if you find that other journals aren't accepting publications, say from scholars in the global south because of maybe the standards, the methodologies, and things like that, Gary could actually provide a platform where those kinds of publications are supported. So there's additional peer support to ensure that those publications go from point zero to point two or point one or whatever makes them publishable.
Mhm. Love that. Okay, one more question, and then that's all we have time for today, but we will be sending out a recording of this. A few people have asked to repeat sections of the session, so we're just going to send out the recording with the slides. But final question is from Rita. They're wondering if this applies to somebody who's doing research in law, and how in general can we get grants and position ourselves for global visibility? Final question.
Thank you very much. And I think that's a very good question because my background's in law. Like I
Perfect.
mentioned, my background's in law. But one of the things I've always done is even when I studied law as an undergraduate, my motivation was, what's the value of this? Why do we even study law? What do lawyers do? What's the value? And the reason I mention that is because I'm mindful of the strengths, but also the limits of the law and the need for law to interact with other disciplines to actually come up with credible, effective solutions to problems. And so my advice to someone who's in law and when it comes to grant applications is to think beyond law as the complete answer to whatever problems that there are. What you find is that a lot of times you need the law to interact with whether it's economic theories, political theories, something from the natural sciences. You just need something else to make it more complete. And this is not just for law, it also applies to other disciplines as well. More and more funders are more interested in interdisciplinary, even transdisciplinary work. So at the very least, let's be open to exploring problems in a very holistic manner that thinks about law in context and in relation to other disciplines as well.
Thank you so much. This brings us to the end of our session. We appreciate everybody for being here and asking such excellent questions. Let's see if my slides are appearing. There you go. You should be able to see that now. So thank you so much, everybody. This brings us to the end of today's session. We want to extend a sincere appreciation to our speaker today, Dr. Petty Obani, for your brilliant contribution, and a special thanks to everybody who participated and asked such great questions. A recording will be sent out, as well as certificates for those who did register and attend. You can follow us on social media. We're on LinkedIn and Facebook, and we hope to see you at an upcoming event. We've been doing these monthly with all different speakers, and all of the recordings are on our YouTube channel as well. So you can always go back and watch those past sessions. And that's all we have time for today. Hope you have a wonderful day. Bye, everyone.
Thanks and bye for now.
Wait, let me call your daddy. Hey, the crow.